southern border as a sort of a U.S. own goal, a needless own goal during the last administration. The United States population up until 4 years ago polled as being very strongly in favor of immigration. Now it's polling as skeptical or hostile towards immigration to the U.S. And we have seen this movie before. After World War I, the United States put really restrictive rules on immigration from the rest of the world that we didn't relax until the 1960s. I think we've benefited tremendously from the immigration that we've had since then. And every country, every rich country, has questions about how they are going to regulate immigration to get to a sort of a win-win for people coming from other countries and for their own citizens. And it's an art, not a science. If you don't pay adequate attention to it, I think you get populist backlash, and we've seen that in Europe, we've seen that in the USA. There's no populist backlash in Japan because there's appreciably no immigration from abroad. But this is something which also I'd like to emphasize is good for lower income developing countries as well, because immigration from poorer areas to richer areas creates remittances back home, and there are hundreds of billions of dollars in remittances flowing back to poorer countries around the world today. I dare say that money is being spent more wisely and more effectively than a lot of the development assistance budgets.
The scale, Nick, that we should expect that's going to occur as we go forward, I mean, are the numbers just going to bulge as we
It'll be a sort of a push and pull sort of thing as we see depopulation in richer areas of the world. I think by 2050 we can expect most of the current richer areas of the world to be experiencing depopulation. There are also the places that are going to, that right now account for most of the world's economic output. So the countries that are successful in a sort of a competitive migration policy, I think are going to have a great advantage. Not everybody is going to be successful in that because you have to have sort of the secret sauce that allows you to bring in newcomers and help create loyal and productive citizens.
Paul, if we think about it from a perspective of being able to cope with the migration flows, obviously in the United States issues come up about whether there are enough jobs, and that's a complicated question. In Europe it's been a big issue. The UK was a factor in Brexit. Insights on how to deal with the employment issue and the capacity to deal with the flows of people.
And maybe, Carlos, go back and connect that to where we started on demographics. As populations age and they shift to the sort of the older part of the spectrum, we're going to need people to work in healthcare and services, etc. We also benefit greatly in this country from migrant workers in the agriculture and construction sector. So I think denying that that's part of the solution is just very short-sighted. Nick, I like your term. I haven't heard that before. Sort of competitive migration policy. So we have to figure out a way to balance getting the workers into these sectors we need. Maybe this is a kind of an in and out thing, and I agree totally on the remittances. I think that's a very sort of special and very efficient flow back to the home countries. Maybe it's a point system or whatever, but I don't know if maybe you guys have a view. Any country does this better than others, is trying to find the right balance between getting the workers into the sectors we need, trying to preserve the social cohesion and keeping the system orderly, obviously the one we have here. I like the own goal, Nick said as well. I agree with that.
Carl, what are the risks of overly militarizing the solutions to control migration?
Yeah, there's several. So when President Trump was inaugurated very quickly, signed executive orders, and some of those executive orders were to secure the southern border and directing the military to fulfill its role in terms of territorial integrity. Secretary of Defense exit, he quickly said that at a town hall meeting in the Pentagon that U.S. soldiers had spent a lot of years securing other countries' borders. It was time for the U.S. military to secure our own borders. So the direction is clear. We've got about 9,600 active duty forces now down on the border. That's high. But for the United States military, it's occasionally has done backstopping, so to speak, on immigration issues. It's also has been involved in counter-narcotics operations on the southern border. There's a nexus over there. Why would President Trump then move so quickly to move the active duty force down there? As Nick had said, it was a big political issue, and the active duty force can be moved very quickly into position. And Customs and Border Patrol also, its numbers are down. It's understaffed right now, so filling the gap. As well, even the National Guard, it's a common National Guard mission, but the National Guard can't be mobilized as fast as the active duty force. Now, what are the risks then, Charles, you're asking about with this? I think one major risk is that we have the challenge then of so-called mission creep that sets in. The military goes down right now 9,600, not big in terms of the large armed forces, but then if they're effective, if it takes a long time to get CPV up and running to where they should be right now, if the National Guard can't do the mission, then you can just slip into a longer-term mission for the U.S. military where it comes with an opportunity cost. They're on the southern border. They're not thinking about China. They're on the southern border. They're not thinking about Russia. That's ultimately our political leaders' calls about where do they want to use the military. I have one other concern, too, beyond obvious concerns about the cost effectiveness of this. Active duty soldiers aren't necessarily trained for what are law enforcement missions, the equipment that they bring to bear, whereas probably some small drones would be a little bit more effective. They're bringing in some really heavy-duty reconnaissance aircraft. But the final concern I've got is with the optics of all of this, and then as you're talking about the militarization of the mission. I was in New Delhi about a month ago when a C-17 U.S. Air Force cargo aircraft, C-17, landed in New Delhi. And off the aircraft then came U.S. Air Force airmen dressed in their uniforms. And coming off the aircraft was a group of Indian deportees in the shackles. And gosh, I wish that had not been a U.S. Air Force aircraft and U.S. airmen. The negative impact of those kind of images on the United States military are substantial.
So, can I make two more points, just data points that may be of interest to our gathering here. One is that ever since we started collecting these numbers in the United States, which was before the Civil War, there's never been a point when we've had such a high proportion of foreign-born people in America as we have today. It's almost 1 in 6. The other, not unrelated, is there's never been a point since we started collecting these numbers when the American economy has been as dependent upon foreign-born labor as it is today. For the prime age work group, over 1 in 5, getting towards 1 in 4 employees, job holders, job wealth creators, born overseas, and how one changes that through policy without causing immense dislocations to our economy is a question that I'd love to hear someone answer.
You know, and Carl's also, just following up what you were saying, Nick, about how important this issue is to the American people right now. When I talk about the challenges, the risk of using the military, you set that against the fact that right now President Trump in his approval ratings, one of the highest approval ratings he gets is on immigration. 48% favorable, 40% are negative. And so he's responding to what the American people are calling for. Once again, I worry about the so-called mission creep. If the military is the one that's getting this done right now, then what's to call it off?
Well, it's an important caution that you raise because there are civilian functions and there are military functions that we see in our society. There's a reason why they were separated. And it means that you have to invest adequately in both in order to be able to do the jobs in both. And we should learn that there have been times when we haven't adequately invested in both the personnel and the civilian side, and at times when we haven't necessarily done the best job of managing the policy. And here we are in a situation where it's brought us to, in one way or another, a crisis point. And we have to be conscious of what the solution is and where it could take us. Carl, I want to take us to jump to Europe. You've served in NATO headquarters. You've commanded NATO troops in Afghanistan. You've worked hand in hand with other countries, particularly in Europe. Are we in a danger of a fracturing transatlantic relationship?
Yeah, I think we're trending in this direction. That said, had we had President Biden 2.0, or any other Republican, or maybe most other Democratic candidates have won and we're now in the Oval Office, I think, Carlos, we have to recognize there is a bigger trend that's out there. It's called multipolarity. And whether whoever's in the White House right now, would we be trending over not next year and risking disintegration of NATO, but over the next decade, 2 decades, are we going to get more hemispheric? And you look at where President Trump is, seems to be moving with concern with the border, drugs, that's hemispheric, it's border. He talks about Canada, he talks about Greenland, he talks about the Panama Canal. So I don't know what his calculus is right now in terms of how much stock does he put in alliances, and then that's going to be informed by how does he see the world and where does he want the United States of America to be. But my own view is that in Europe right now, there's great concern about the direction lines. There's some that are of the view perhaps he wants to blow the alliance up and walk away from it. Others are saying, no, it's transactional. He's going to keep on going for bilateral deals with different allies. But even that, if that's the case, the bilateral deals are probably going to be corrosive to the collective alliance. So I am concerned of where this goes. There's perhaps the possibility that he is being more transactional at this point, that he wants to preserve the alliance. If you look at what Secretary Esper or Secretary Hexai said recently, he said that beyond all, that the U.S. remains committed to NATO as an alliance. There's the Russia factor. If President Putin does not respond to the peace overtures right now, the ceasefire overtures, will that lead to a reaction from the White House and then a reinforcement of NATO? And then finally, in fairness to President Trump, Europe right now is really looking at a big rearmament program, at least on paper. They're talking about a rearmament program of $840 billion over the next 4 years. Every president of the United States since JFK has been trying to get the Europeans to get more serious about their defense. If they move forward with that program, then I guess you'd have to give President Trump a lot of credit. But what's left of the alliance after that takes place?
And indeed, Europeans, I was struck at the Munich Security Conference this year that you heard from every European leader a consensus on the need to invest more investment in defense. You've seen measures that have been taken both on the part of the European Commission and then in particular Germany. But Paul, this is going to entail massive budgetary requirements. Can Europe cope with it, both in terms of financially, but even implementing?
That's exactly what I scribbled down right before your question, Carlos. Europe has another existential crisis, which is economic and their competitiveness. So many of us know about the Draghi report from former ACB head Mario Draghi. I mentioned earlier these 3 kind of poles of the global manufacturing order. One is US, one is China, the other is Europe. Europe's been sliding in terms of its competitiveness, and China has been encroaching on their market share. I think automobiles is probably exhibit A there. And as we've heard from Dan and others earlier this week, a lot of European executives like to come and do business here in the US. Europe doesn't have a fully functioning capital market structure like we do here. They don't have a tech sector. So in a sense, they're outsourcing some of that to the US. So they've got kind of an economic wake-up call. They've got a sort of a defense and geostrategic wake-up call, and all of this costs money. We've started to see some movement from European leaders, even in the last week to spend more on defense. But if you're spending more on defense and you're spending more to build up your capital markets and your tech infrastructure and everything else, they need to be more autonomous. That's a huge challenge for them. So whether they can do it is going to be the big question on the global economy. Is Europe going to continue to be the third node, or they will become like a third wheel, and then it's a US-China game? I really think that's on the table, and we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years whether that plays out.
Collectively, Paul, the European Union is the world's largest economic bloc.
Absolutely.
So a significant step.
It's true that confidence and trust are really hard to build among allies. They're so easy to destroy. But no matter who is president, we've got an underlying structural demographic problem with our alliances. And the problem is that the United States is a growing population and a relatively youthful one by comparison. And Europe and our allies in East Asia are aging, shrinking countries. That means that they need the United States more as time goes on. And they can contribute, but it becomes more expensive and more difficult to contribute. So there's going to be a constantly shifting, if you want to call it that, terms of trade between the U.S. and allies. And we have to manage that in a way that doesn't end up being a lose-lose for everybody.
Nick, I think that's a very important point. And then when you talk about the trust that underpins all of this, so to connect East Asia then to Europe, believe me, our Korean allies, Japanese allies, Australians, they're looking very much at how things are playing out in NATO right now. And if the United States walks away from those commitments, then their fear is they're next, and that would have some really serious consequences in the Asia Pacific.
I feel like we're in a time warp. I'm looking at the clock, and we have a little over 6 minutes left. I'm not sure what happened to us. But anyway, so we need to be short here. But Carl, I want to come back to China, because you've made the choice to live there and teach there for a period of time. What drove you there, and what are you seeing from the experience that you have on the ground?
Well, a big part of my professional career was East Asia and China, so it's in my professional DNA, and my wife was Chinese American, so it's in her biological DNA. So good to be there, and a rare opportunity. We've got so many of the people I really respect, great China hands, but they're going to China now for maybe 2 days, 3 days for a conference. It's not the old days where you can live there, so we're blessed we can. And I'm seeing that some of our better China hands are getting a little bit out of touch, not with the macro analysis, but maybe with the touching the people on the street. So 2 quick observations there that we've all read, and really interested in Paul's view about the macro analysis of China and the economic headwinds it's facing. Time on the ground there, Carlos, is it connecting the dots at the micro level. So at Tsinghua University, there, Harvard, there, MIT, the students there that are graduating, they're all going to get jobs because it's Harvard, MIT, but the jobs they're going to get are not like the jobs they expected 5 years ago. If you go to Zhengzhou University, 2nd tier, maybe 3rd tier university, about 400 miles south of Beijing, the graduating class, about 40% of them will not get jobs. 40%. These are really serious problems. The party is back on its heels a little bit for its mishandling of COVID. Until recently, they were back on their heels for foreign policy, but the news out of Washington is perhaps making Beijing feel a little bit better right now. And then, but at the same time, all those negatives that China's facing, not to be underappreciated. Though a couple of points, we know, I'm sure Paul will talk about their massive manufacturing base. 32% of the world's manufacturing is coming out of China right now. Shipbuilding, which President Trump rightly wants to ramp up, they're outproducing us 248 to 1. Good luck in turning that around quickly. Engineers, about 1 million plus engineers are graduating from China every year, and these are high quality. We, the United States, about 100,000 a year. And then, well, yeah, but China can't innovate. That's the wrap. They've caught, now that they're at the point they're about caught up, but they can't innovate. until you look at their EVs, until you look at the movie Ne Zha 2 that just came out, more money than Inside Out 2 is the #1 animation movie in global history. You look at their gaming industry, the game Wukong that came out. We have this $400 billion global gaming industry, and China's moving to the top of that through innovation. So what do I walk away from China with? The view is that if we're going to compete against China, we're not going to win over a tariff war. We've got to heal ourselves. We've got to heal ourselves economically, socially, and politically.
We got 3 minutes.
I'm watching the clock.
Paul,
Let me jump-
Nick,
let me
I want
jump
both
in
of
with
you
a-
to comment, so
I'll jump
both of
in
you
with
be
a
quick.
Yeah, I'll jump in with a factoid since Carl pinged me. Well, China, unfortunately, is getting old before it gets rich, right, which is a big challenge. It's way behind Japan and other countries in Europe on the per capita income league tables. That's problem number one. The other problem is we don't talk much about the distribution of income within China. We sort of think that because it's a socialist republic that income is equally distributed, but I'll give you one way to think about it. In the US, think of the ratio between the per capita income in the richest state and the poorest state. Everybody know what the richest state is in the US? It's not Texas, by the way. I think it's Connecticut. So Connecticut's got the highest per capita income, and it's twice the level of Mississippi, which is the lowest per capita income. So, you know, we need to adjust that for housing or whatever, but it's 2 to 1. That number in China is 5 to 1, and it hasn't moved that quickly. So coastal China, you know, right above Shanghai, Zhejiang province has the richest per capita income, and I think Gansu, one of the interiors. But that's a huge problem, right? So you have a country that got old before it got rich. It's still a manufacturing powerhouse, but we've got a huge distribution of income. It does have world-class institutions and scholars and everything else, as Carl mentioned, but there's a long tail of folks who haven't benefited from that, and I think that's going to be an important dynamic to watch.
Nick.
To me, the most important demographic problem that people don't talk about in China is the implosion of the family. When you have only children begetting only children, the shrinking of the extended family network, which has been the social safety net for China since the beginning of the civilization, it evaporates. And we don't know what's going to go in there to replace it. Something will, but we don't know how effective that's going to be. And that may turn out to be much more important than the aging or the shrinking of labor force or some of the other headcount things that we all pay attention to. I actually would love to take this opportunity to ask you a question, Carl, about something I've been musing about, but you're somebody who could muse about it intelligently. What is going to happen in China with regards to casualty aversion when you've got a one-child People's Liberation Army? I mean, I know it's impossible to say, but how do you think about it?
And you have 20 seconds.
Nick, you know, you don't know until the conflict
until
begins that you're onto something very important. It is impacting their recruiting. One is economic reasons, you know, why go into the PLA when you might have a better alternative. Although with unemployment up, it's helping their recruiting like it would help ours. But also there's the question about if my son or daughter goes, then what can happen here?
Wow. How do you summarize this conversation? One of the things in China I think is worth emphasizing is that they obviously have internal problems, huge issues on population growth or contraction, but at the same time they are so competitive. And those internal problems are going to drive them to export more because they have to. So if you haven't thought about the competitive aspects of it, think about it because you're going to see more of it. I hope one of the things that you take from this conversation is one of the points that we started out with right now. 3/4 of the world is not replacing its population, which means that one of the factors that's going to happen is, Nick's term, the competitive migration issues. How do you manage this in a way that maintains stability and growth and doesn't just become the source of political tension as it has? I mean, that's the tendency that we're moving in right now. We haven't figured out how to deal with this problem. And one of the things that I think was important was think back about the discussion of migration in developing countries. And when we got into the security issues and even on the other questions, they all circulated back not to military solutions, although we have to worry about terrorism, but they came back to issues like education, business opportunities, job creation, healthcare, because in the end, if you don't deal with those things, then the conflictual issues and migration issues become even stronger. And what we need to bring it back to is that these things have an implication for the United States. Because if we don't worry, if we don't think about them, if we don't plan for them, if we don't think about where the world's population centers are going to be, where investment is going to go, we're not going to be successful in business, and we're not going to be able to keep our country